And we are live with round 14.
And we are live with round 14.
Public forum debate.
14. Public forum debate. 14. Public forum debate. 14. Public forum debate.
Let's try the first speaker.
Let's try the first speaker. Let's try the first.
All right, we'll try one more time. Hopefully this is better. Is there any reverberation of sound now? Excellent, we got that solved. I want to welcome everyone to NSDA's round 14, National Championships of Public Forum Debate. The two teams debating are teams number 366 and 244. Team 366 will speak second on the affirmative side. The negative side will be 244 speaking first. Best of luck to the students.
All right, is everyone ready? Okay. David and I negate. Observation 1. We define two factors that optimize quality education. The first is quality teachers. The ASCD reports that the most important factor in student learning is the teacher and concludes that improving teachers would improve outcomes more than any other single factor. The second is lived experiences. Brun 15 reports that emotional health, by creating motivation, is the greatest predictor of life satisfaction, while academic success is the least important. Our sole contention concerns making a market out of education. Smith 19 explains, neoliberalism, not to be confused with modern-day liberals or Democrats, is an ideology that affirms the values of free market competition. Metcalf 17 furthers that neoliberalism views the free market economy as the model for all human activity. In terms of education, Mora 11 explains that charter schools are a function of neoliberalism insofar as they compete with traditional schools for both students and tax funding. Subpoint A is the marketization of education space. Blakely 17 writes that in the private sector, competition creates winners and losers, but in the public sphere, the effect of a school losing are catastrophic. Indeed, the NPE reports that because federal and state funding follows students, charter schools redirect money away from public schools. There are two impacts. The first is teachers. The ITPI 18 finds that charter school funding results in a 19 to 66% loss to the average district's budget. The EPI 19 finds that this funding crisis has led to schools not having the funds to staff vacancies, leading to a massive teacher shortage crisis in public schools. Will 20 finds that losing 10% of budgets would cause 173,000 teaching jobs to be lost. The second impact is education deserts. Barnum 19 finds that the effects of siphoning away funding from public schools can be irreversible, as districts often recoup less than 20% of lost funding each year. As a result, Blakely 17 writes that in Detroit, due to the widespread defunding and closing of schools, there are now educational deserts where students must travel for hours simply to attend school. Additionally, Larson 14 finds that students experiencing school closure are 10% more likely to drop out. This issue disproportionately impacts low-income students, as Blakely 17 reports that the wealthy can simply move their children to other schools. Neoliberal market competition in education thus creates a vicious cycle in which low-income communities are further punished for their poverty. Subpoint B is the commodification of outcomes. Sunbomb 18 reports that charter schools must achieve strict academic outcomes in order to stay open. This is because, as Real 16 explains, neoliberal reformists increase the emphasis on standardized testing in tandem with the implementation of charter schools as a metric to evaluate the quality of the schools. As a result, Simon 13 writes that charter and public schools are locked in a market competition with outcomes hinging on the results of standardized tests. In other words, proliferating the system's emphasis on them. There are two impacts. The first is teachers. Ollie 19 reports that because of the neoliberal model's reliance on testing, a teacher's effectiveness, and often pay, is measured by student test results. This pressures teachers to use highly scripted curriculums, leading to an exodus from the profession. The second impact is degraded critical thinking. Saltman 10 reports that value is now defined by test scores, undermining intellectualism. Because there is finite study time, there's no place for learning that doesn't raise scores, and he concludes that the ethical, social, and political aspects of our lives are no longer relevant to education. As a result, Watkins 12 explains that the education system ignores the social context in which students learn, in effect erasing their identities. Crucially, Saltman 09 explains that such critical knowledge is necessary if students are to have the skills to engage as public citizens in the forming and sustaining of communities. Mulder 18 concludes that existing inequalities are thus reinforced within the system. It fosters the acceptance of the capitalist status quo and its hierarchical structures. Thus, neoliberal education reproduces the structural inequality it was designed to combat. This is cataclysmic. Giroux 11 writes that no democratic society can survive without educational practices which produce citizens who are critical, self-reflective, willing to make moral judgments, and act in a socially responsible fashion. Thus, we negate.
All right, cool. Is everyone all good? Sweet. Coben and I affirm, resolved on balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the US. Our sole contention is closing the achievement gap. Linda Hammond of the Brookings Institute in 2019 explains, public schools have systematically failed predominantly Black children living in urban areas. As a result, there exists a 2 grade level achievement gap between Black and white students. While public schools have continued to fail their students, Emily Langhorne of US News in 2018 concludes, charter founders have embarked on a mission of social justice and intentionally locate schools in urban areas to close the gap. Specifically, charter schools make up for the failings of urban public schools in 3 ways. First, by acknowledging disadvantage. While both public and charter schools teach underserved students in urban areas, Adrian Pothero of Education Weekly in 2020 explains, charter schools serve students of color in prep school-like environments with high academic expectations and extended school days. While Brian Charles of Governing in 2018 writes, public schools offer fewer advanced classes and extracurriculars, and overall less developed curricula. Even worse, Ann Wicks of the Catalyst Institute in 2019 concludes, 40% of classrooms in such schools made up largely of students of color never received an assignment on grade level. It is not a matter of money. Charters actually receive less funding. Instead, it's a matter of approach, one that the research agrees with. Robert Pondisco writes in his book, How the Other Half Learns, the best way to close the achievement gap is high expectations and rigorous curriculum, which is exactly what charters offer. Second is by doing more with less. Corey DeAngelis of Brown University in 2019 quantifies, urban charter schools are 42% more cost-effective than traditional public schools. Casey Guin explains why this is the case of Education Next in 2017. Public schools' direct spending formulas allocate more money to lower performing schools to support improvement. In short, districts incentivize schools to fail. As a result, Jill Barshay of the Hetchinger Report in 2018 finds, despite higher levels of funding, test scores in majority Black urban public schools have remained stagnant. But the model of charters is different. Emily Langhorne of Forbes in 2019 warrants, charter schools answer to authorizers, not the government. And if the students aren't learning, the school will undergo a period of probation or closure. Because the incentives are different, charters have no choice but to serve the underserved. Third is by increasing teacher diversity. Dr. Amber Northam of the Fordham Institute finds, Black students in charter schools are 50% more likely to have a same-race teacher than those in public schools. While urban charters do indeed educate more minority students, Kevin Mackin of the 74 Million finds that teaching staff at urban charters are 40% more proportionally diverse. Matthew DiCarlo of the Shanker Institute in 2019 explains why. State-level oversight entities and charter authorizers emphasize teacher diversity as an expectation before schools are approved. So if charters don't comply, they don't open. But Hatchett of U Indiana in 2017 explains why this is so important. African American children are 3 times as likely to be placed in gifted ed programs if they have a Black teacher. And Lindsay of American University concludes, are also 9% less likely to be exposed to discipline. It is for these 3 reasons Max Eden of the Manhattan Institute in 2020 finds charter schools provide Black students in poverty with an additional 59 days of learning each year. And Davis of the University of Pennsylvania quantifies. Such students are 10% more likely to attend college and 9% more likely to enroll for at least 4 semesters. But it doesn't stop there because charters push all public schools to do better. Matt Barnum of Fordham in 2019 concludes, a higher market share of charter schools in urban districts closes the achievement gap for all students by 2/3. And the proof is in the pudding. Michael Hansen of Brookings in 2019 finds, charters have already closed the Black-white achievement gap by 25%. Thus, we affirm.
All right, I'm ready for cross whenever you are.
Okay, I'm all good too.
Do you mind if we have the first question as the first speaking team?
Yeah, go for it.
So if we were to be charitable and grant you some marginal benefits of charter schools, what happens to the 50 million kids in the public school system who potentially face school closure due to a lack of funding?
Yeah, so that's the Barnum evidence that we read you at the bottom, and it also ties into our second warrant of efficiency. Because charter schools are going into areas where public schools are struggling, the competition aspect is pushing public schools to do better and become more efficient with their spending. Public schools don't actually lose funding when charter schools move in.
Let me be a little bit more specific. I'm not talking about public schools that stay open and then face market pressure. What I'm talking about is places like Detroit, which saw 234 schools shut down because of funding going to the charter schools. So I'm saying, like, we need to account for the situations in which schools don't remain open, not cases in which schools are just like themselves.
So long story short,
situations.
What?
So how do you account for those situations?
Yeah, so what we'd argue is that schools aren't actually going to be closing because charters don't really divert that much funding, and either way, funding is still remaining and there's ways to recoup it. We'd say Detroit school closures aren't actually because of charter schools, it's uniquely because of other problems in the area.
I mean, we'll contest that, but you're welcome to watch.
Okay, so let's talk about, I guess, your whole contention talking about like neoliberalism and the issues with market competition. So even if charter schools go away, is market competition going to disappear with them?
Our evidence is extremely specific, which says that competition between charter schools and public schools is what produces the harm. What REAL tells you is that the introduction of neoliberal interests into the education system meant that standardized testing was the only metric to compare between charter and public schools.
But neoliberal,
a new competitive entity is absolutely responsible for these issues.
But neoliberalism competition has already been existing in the education sector. We've already been seeing with the ACT scores in order to get into college, and private schools are already being another market factor.
I'm glad you bring
unique to charters.
I'm glad you bring this up, actually, because we're not talking about the ACT and SAT. What we are talking about is the regular standardized tests, which charter schools and public schools are forced to take so that prospective parents can evaluate the good of the schools that they're comparing between. What we're saying is, like, you have to assign a value to each entity in a competitive market, and you've artificially made it competitive with the introduction of charter schools. That's what.
So just a quick follow-up question. How long have standardized tests existed for?
Depends in what capacity. What we're saying is the standardized testing that we're talking about, which produces teaching to the test in charter schools, started after, like, in the early 1990s, after charter schools were introduced. But can I take a question, please?
Yeah, that's fine.
So you say that, like, oftentimes public schools become cost effective. So does that, like, where are they cutting from? Are they cutting from, like, guidance counselors, science classes, art classes? Where's the money coming from?
Yeah, so instead of spending a bunch of money on like top level administrative people, instead public schools are now funneling that towards teachers and actually benefiting education as a whole and not just wasting it on useless spending.
But they could cut things like guidance counselors.
No, it's not like efficiency for guidance counselors. It's for, Actually, can I call for a few pieces of evidence?
Absolutely.
Okay. Whatever evidence you read that test scores increased after, like, standardized tests increased after charters were started in the market. Like, whatever you read for that.
Okay, so the Rial and Simon evidence?
Yeah.
If this isn't the card that Lillian asked for, can I see Sonbom as well?
Yeah, I just sent Rial and Simon. I'll send Sonbom right now.
Let us know when y'all have got it so we can make sure.
Okay, we just got Rial and Simon, so
And I just sent Sonbom.
Okay. I just got Sonbom, so.
Are y'all taking any prep or are you good?
no, we're speaking second, so
If you're
Sure.
taking
I just wanted to know if you were reading the cards or anything. Okay. It's going to start off with an observation on their case, just about the evidence, and then it will be going straight down their case, responding to their arguments. Okay. Is everybody ready? Let's start the time now. Start off with an observation. You're not going to be giving credit to any of their evidence. Don't be fooled by the official sounding names of the statistics they read, because one, they stem from charter lobbying groups. Lecker 19 reports that the effort to push charter schools is by wealthy out-of-state individuals with no connection to the education system. Mulder 18 reports that this lobbying was done in opposition to actual educators and students. And indeed, Roy 15 writes that charter schools were the biggest special interest group in state politics, outspending teacher unions 2-1. But secondly is because RISGA 16 writes that charter schools use selection bias. Because charter schools are less regulated, they can require students who apply for lotteries to fill out immense applications, attracting already engaged parents and already high achieving students. They conclude that students who enter charter schools were already higher achieving than their peers. That means obviously some studies are going to be skewed towards charter schools, but that does not mean that charter schools are beneficial for education. And thirdly is because RISGA 16 finds that charter schools disproportionately suspend Black students and students with special needs, ranging from those with disabilities to English language learners, as a way to disincentivize students who are underperforming to continue attending, artificially raising their test scores. For that reason, the Institute of Education Sciences write in their meta-analysis of analyzing numerous studies with exclusively strong methodological designs that charter schools do not have a significant impact on student achievement. At that point, the only thing charter schools do is take away funding from public schools and orient thinking into a mode of exclusively standardized testing. Let's go on to their case regardless. At the top, they say that there's this huge achievement gap. However, recognize that this currently is closing. However, because the National Center on Education Statistics write that the nationwide Black dropout rate has decreased from 13.1% to 6.2%, which is only 1% higher than white students. We know that this isn't all the way there, but the only risk that this trend is reversed is if predominantly urban schools lose funding because charter schools open nearby. This is always going to outweigh their case because there are 50 million students in public schools, 7.7 million of them which are Black, whereas there's only 2 million students in all charter schools regardless of race. Let's go on to their first warrant about about disadvantages. Firstly, you can cross-apply our case because we would say that charter schools take away funding from the majority of public schools, which means the vast majority of people are actually hurt, even if a few are helped. But secondly, charter schools on balance are discriminatory because of the observation, as Camera 18 explains, that charter schools don't encourage students with poor academic behavior prior to actually apply, which skews their systems. Then they talk about how charter schools do more with less, and they say that schools are incentivized to do bad because they get more funding when their test results go down. But one, the Economic Policy Institute writes that impoverished students, due to a lack of access to various resources, underperform academically. If their argument was true that public schools get more funding when students perform bad, then we would see poor public schools get more money than their counterparts. However, the U.S. News and World Report finds that impoverished districts get 16% less funding than unimpoverished districts, which means that the empirics of this argument aren't true. But secondly, the JRF Foundation writes that because there are so many factors that contribute to the outcomes of students, such as parental engagement, access to external resources, etc., only 14% of the variation in students' performance is actually accounted for by the quality of school. That means even if you believe that schools are incentivized to perform badly because they get more money, that doesn't actually impact students as much as reforming the entirety of the education system and other structural issues would. At that point, you prefer our case because the Mulder evidence writes that neoliberal intrusion into schooling has degraded critical thinking skills schools, which fosters the acceptance of structural inequalities in the status quo. Go on to their last warrant about teacher diversity. 1, Carlo 19 finds that the reason why charter schools have more Black and minority teachers is because they're literally just in way more urban communities, not because they try to get more minority teachers. But that means you can turn the argument against them, because Menastra 13 concludes that that means that students who attend charter schools are twice as segregated as public schools. And that's really bad, as Moreno 17 finds that when you have a segregated schools, that actually decreases academic achievement, which means they perpetuate the cycle of low academic achievement. But then they talk about how this is actually going to benefit public schools. But 1, recognize that this doesn't take into account things like coronavirus and the resulting recession, which Baruch 20 explains, like public schools have already lost a ton of money and they can't make any more cuts, which is why they just close down when charter schools open nearby. But secondly, they cut from things like guidance counselors and janitorial programs, which worsen student health. And our evidence tells you that's the most important thing in adjusting for outcomes. For all these reasons, we are very happy to negate. Thank you.
Can I see a few pieces of evidence?
Sure.
I want to see Roy 15, the card that you read after that in your overview, EIP.
EIP.
EPI.
Oh, EPI, sorry. And that should be good.
Should all be sent.
As soon as I get the evidence, I'll start. Okay, I got it right now. Starting. Okay, that was 1 minute and 18 views. And if everyone's ready, time will start now. Their first argument is that charter schools skim the majority of students off of public schools. But first, it's not Panera, you can't pick two. Their next argument is that charter schools serve high proportions of minority students, make them pick one. Either they're serving very disadvantaged students or they're skimming the majority off the top. But second, it's not true anyways. RAND 19 analyzed nationwide transfer rates between charter schools and public schools and finds the students transferring into public school or charter schools actually have lower test rates than those that are transferring into public schools. This This means that charters aren't getting the best students, they're getting the average students, and still they're increasing their test scores. But then they say that the achievement gap is decreasing in the status quo. First, this is our entire argument. Charter schools have been around since the 1980s, and as a result of this, the achievement gap is going down. But second, this disproves their argument, because if charter schools are really having a negative effect on public schools and the entire school system, then why is the achievement gap going down? They're contradicting themselves again. But our second argument concerns efficiency. They say that public schools nearby charter schools get less funding. First, I'll get to this later. And second, it's not true. Barnum 19 finds that while they might have less funding in the short term, in the long term, they become more efficient. But then they say that we can't control for student outcomes at home. Neither can public schools. We can only do and we can only fix what we can, which is the school system, which is the same thing they're talking about. But on our next argument of minority teachers, they say they're segregated. First, they contradict themselves. Earlier, they said they're not segregated and they serve high achieving students, but then they say, no, they serve really low achieving students. But second, that's not even true. The segregation is always going to exist. The districts have been historically redlined. Trait 19 concludes the next best thing we can do is go into those segregated areas and help the students that have been historically disadvantaged. That's why the achievement gap is already closing. But let's talk about their arguments. First, recognize that even if all of their arguments are true, they make an argument for the affirmative by saying that the achievement gap is going down. This literally just proves our point. But second, charter schools actually prove other public schools to improve. Barnum 19 finds that when the market share of charter schools increases, public schools nearby feel a force of competition and thus have to improve their practices and increase test scores. But even then, their first argument is about neoliberalism and how charter schools have hurt the industry. But first, we have to go back to why charters were created in the first place. Hatchinger 19 finds that before charter schools, public schools acted like a monopoly. They were not innovating, they were using bureaucratic policies, and test scores were declining. That's why we created charter schools as a radical departure from the failures of the stuffy, bureaucratic public school system. But second, they say that charter schools are forced to compete with public schools. That's not the whole story. Rand 19 finds that often charter schools collaborate with public schools because they're not going to fight against each other when their end goal is improving student education. This is why when charter schools locate next to a public school, their test scores increase. But their first argument is about redirecting funding. First, don't let them create a false narrative where evil charter schools steal funding. Charter schools are public schools too. Second, Barnum 19 finds that while in the short term funding may decrease because they have less students, they find that in the long term, the funding evens out and they become more efficient. But third, let's recognize what they're saying. They're saying that poor disadvantaged students should stay at public schools because somehow they're going to lose money and not going to be able to handle it. But fourth, 34 states have provisions that account for decreases in funding and offset it so that they can still fund their schools. But fifth, in the long term, again, public schools become more efficient. But then they say that charter schools hurt them through market competition and increased test scores. They say that Detroit schools closed. The reason schools in Detroit closed because they were wasting money. Public schools waste $800 billion every year and nobody does anything about it. But when a charter school fails, it gets closed down to stop the problem. But second, charter schools are key in creating innovation. Reese 19 finds that empirically they've created new innovations like smaller class sizes and better curriculum. The reason charters innovate is because they're forced to compete. Lack of competition wasn't working before charter schools were created, and it is now. That's why the achievement gap is decreasing. Thus, we're so proud to affirm.
We are a little bit of prep before cross.
Okay.
Okay, that was 3:45. We have 15 seconds left. Can you mute me? Can I have the first question?
Go ahead.
Okay, so you read me that the achievement gap going down in the status quo is proof that charter schools are working. How many Black students are in the public schooling system?
What do you mean?
How many
Like
Black
how many
students?
Black?
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know the percent off the top of my head, but
it
charter
is
schools are also public.
it is 7.7 million, right? Now, how many students total are in charter schools?
I'm sure you can tell me.
It's 2 million. So can you explain to me how 2 million students, the majority of which aren't even Black, outperforming 7.7 million students who are Black in regular public schools, decrease the achievement gap as a whole?
Well, that's our argument, that when a charter locates next to a public school, they have to compete with each other. And that's why when a charter school locates next to a public school, the achievement gap for the students in the public school decreases by 2/3.
Yeah,
Can I have
okay,
a question?
so,
Can I have a
well,
question?
you dropped all 3 refutations I
Can I-
put specifically
I-
about public schools, but sure.
Okay. What happens if a public school wastes money?
Nothing much.
Nothing much, exactly. So when a public school wastes money, they keep existing, they waste money, they fail their students. What happens when a charter school wastes money?
Okay, wait. So the hidden premise in there is that like they fail their students, right? So I get what you're about to
Yeah.
say, which is that when charter schools like waste money, they close down.
Yeah.
We would say that like wasting money isn't inherently a bad thing insofar as you don't read any negative impacts that come off of it. We would say even if charter schools are more
Okay, okay.
wait, let me just finish. We would say
That's
that
fine.
even if charter schools are more cost effective insofar as they can siphon away like 60% of funding from public schools, which causes closures, it doesn't matter if like public
60%. So you're saying, you just said that charter schools don't account for much students in the public education system, but then you say that they steal 60% of all funding. How does that work?
like in Santa Barbara. So yeah,
Santa
well,
Barbara.
well, I said up to 66%. The ITPI evidence, which we read in constructive, is really
Okay.
specific and saying that it can siphon away 19 to 66% of the
Okay,
district's
why
budget.
is
Also-
Santa
also
Barbara
this-
representative of the whole country?
Well, that's just the 66% card, but we also give the NPE evidence right above that, which is talking about the entire country, which is that it siphons away money. But we also
much
have lower, like 19%.
19%.
Wait,
So
also
what happens in the long run when a public school loses money? Do they just give up and fail, or like what happens?
What do you mean?
Like when a charter school takes money away from a public school, like you say happens, like what does the public school do? Do they just admit defeat and like don't do anything to cut
Yes,
costs?
in Detroit, there have been over 200 schools that closed specifically because of
Yeah,
charter
let's
schools.
talk.
and
Let's
it-
talk about Detroit,
Sure.
right?
Perfect.
Why? How were Detroit public schools doing before they were closed?
I don't know, but we would say access.
Atrocious.
Wait,
Their
wait.
graduation rates
wait,
were 30%.
I can grant you full access of that. We would say that giving like a few 100,000 students access to bad education is way more important than giving like hundreds of thousands of students access to zero education, right?
Well, how do you lose hundreds of thousands of students if you yourself say that charter schools are a minuscule part of the education system? I don't like you're saying that the impact's really, really big, but then charter schools are really, really small. It doesn't like connect, but I think we're out of time.
Because the funding is disproportional, but yeah.
Okay, so if everyone's ready, it's going to be an overview on weighing, and then it's going to be our case, and then it's going to be extending the overview that David makes in rebuttal, and then it's going to be their case. Is everyone good? Okay, perfect. Start off with a weighing overview. Here's why even if you grant all their offense, they never win the round. All of their benefits have to do with charter schools. Let me remind you that in total, 2 million kids nationwide attend charter schools. 50 million attend public schools, including 7 million African-American students, meaning that even if you buy a little of our offense about structural reform or structural closures, you are voting for us. The second weighing is that only 14% of student outcomes are reliant on school choice. This means we always outweigh because Mulder tells you that currently standardized testing caused because of neoliberal competition makes structural reform, which is the root cause of the achievement gap, impossible. At that point, you're voting for our side. On our case, on subpoint A, they say charters are also public, so it's like fine that they're competing. This does not respond to the funding argument, which is from the NPE that says they're competing for funding because the money moves with the students. They say from Barnum that in the long term, this is solved. Barnum says it takes like 5 years. This means every time a charter school opens in that 5-year period, they're losing like up to like 60% of their funding, between 19 and 66% of their funding, meaning you're seeing school closures. On deserts on subpoint B, Larson and Blakely are very specific about closures. In places like Philadelphia and also Detroit, you've seen hundreds of schools closed, leaving hundreds of thousands of kids out of school. What Blakely says is that even if it doesn't happen nationally, it's happening in disproportionately poor areas because students can't go to better schools. The weighing is simple. It's not a bad school versus a good school. It's a school or no school. The round is over then when they concede subpoint B. Do not let them come up here and respond in summary. They did not put any ink on it in rebuttal. The only thing they say is that like a public monopoly is bad because there's no innovation. What we are telling you from perspective 15 is that when you isolate for the effects of innovation specifically, you see decreased achievement, which means all the changes charter schools are making are bad ones. But the more important thing is that they drop Rial and Simon, which says that the only reason why there's such an emphasis on standardized tests in the status quo is because of the competition between charter schools and public schools. Simon says that the competition and the outcome of the competition is hinged on standardized test scores, which is why schools are forced to cater to test scores and teach the test in order as a matter of survival. That means you're extending Ollie on the fact of that there's a teacher shortage because people don't want to teach the test. But more importantly, you're extending our critical thinking impact. Saltman says that because of a standardized testing crisis, they are not emphasizing historical, social, or critical thinking skills, meaning that Mulder says when you lack those skills, you lack the ability to critique the structural injustices in the status quo. You never get structural reform on their side. Giroux says this is the demise of civil society because people can no longer make reforms. They don't vote for the right policies. They don't ever solve for the root cause of inequality. Let's talk about their case. I want to be very clear. On the overview, they drop the lobbying point and the fact that most of their studies are funded by charter lobbying groups, which outspend teacher unions 2-1. They also drop the suspensions point. We said that they disproportionately spend Black students. Rizga is very clear this is an issue with competition because they want to get rid of low achieving students, which they perceive as low income. They say that the achievement gap going down means charter schools are working. No, there are 7.7 Black students in public schools, so clearly it isn't like a function of charters. On their teacher diversity point, they basically say there's segregation in charters in public schools too, but it's 2 times in charter schools, which means that you're getting all the low achievement impacts. On public schools, they drop all the stuff about how COVID means they're not going to be cutting budgets. That's why you're negating.
We'll take prep starting
Okay, cool. Is everyone all good? Sweet. At the top of their case, one critical problem that they ignore, and that is that competition is solving for the issues in the education sector right now. Remember the Barnum evidence that we read you at the bottom of the case. Because of the increased competition that we're seeing with charter schools in the area, it is closing the achievement gaps by 2/3 right now. They never interact with this. And they even agree that the achievement gap is decreasing right now between Black and white students. Look at what happened before. Before charter schools, public schools were failing on all aspects. That's what Hetchinger 18 tells you. But charters have closed the gap by breaking up the former public school monopoly, and that is why the achievement gap is closing right now. That is what all of our evidence tells you. Sign your ballot right there. The empirics are on our side. But let's go into their specific arguments. First, on the argument of decreased funding. First, their only example is from Detroit, which is a terrible example of schools that were failing before charters. But second is that charter schools are collaborating with public schools and they don't interact with this argument. Remember that because both charters and public schools have the end goal of helping students, they collaborate together and they don't cause each other to fail. This collaboration increases innovation and helps all students, not just those in charters. But second is that 34 states have implemented measures to offset lost revenue because of decreased enrollment. Funding isn't an issue for public schools. But on their second argument of teaching to the test, remember that charter schools are boosting innovation right now by creating new ways to educate students that isn't just teaching to the test. Job training and STEM-specific programs are boosting education. Competition in terms of test score isn't an issue as charters are innovating new ways to benefit their students. Their argument simply isn't true. But going on to our case, they make a few arguments at the top. First, they say that all of our evidence has been funded by charter schools, but make them point to a specific piece of evidence that's funded by charter schools. The UPenn analysis is a completely independent study. Second, they argue suspensions increase. But remember the RAND evidence that Coben reads you in rebuttal, charter schools are accepting and keeping poor and low-performing students. Suspensions isn't an issue. Finally, they argue that the only issue with that school choice only causes a 14% difference in actual school benefits, but look to the achievement gap closing right now. If it was only a 14% difference, we wouldn't see the achievement gap close by this much. At that point, our third warrant of minority teachers wins us the round. Northam explains that because charter schools have a high diversity condition in order to open, they hire more diverse teachers. Mackin explains that teachers are 40% more diverse at charter schools, and because of this increased diversity, it leads to 59 additional days of education and pushes all public schools to do better. This is closing the Black-white achievement gap by 25% for all students. That's what Hansen 19 tells you.
Are you all ready for cross?
Yeah, you can have the first question.
Thank you. So on our case, you say that the reason why public schools might get better is because of competition. What are public schools and charter schools competing for?
What do you mean? Well, our argument is that like charter schools and public schools aren't these like two evil institutions trying to make as much money as possible. The end goal of every school is to help their students. They're not trying to like cutthroat each other. That's a pretty false narrative. And that's exactly what our evidence indicates. They work together, they innovate new policies and push each other to improve. Can I ask you a question though?
My question was, on our talking about how competition is the root of improvement. The logical implication of this is that they are competing for something, namely students or resources. Is that not correct? Otherwise, you have no competition.
Well, yeah. So they're trying to increase their test scores or quality of education, not just test scores, so that they get the most students. What?
They are focusing on increasing the test scores because that's kind of the objective thing you can.
No. Because when charters market to their students, they're not like, "Whoa, we have really good test scores." They're like, "We offer a high quality education. It's all around good." Like John.
That's not true. The Simon. The Simon evidence that we read you, which you've never responded to throughout this entire round, says explicitly that this market competition hinges specifically on test results.
Okay.
That is what people look at.
I'm sure Hansen says that, but like, let's look at the real world. Parents don't go to a school just because of a test.
Literally this is like a pretty liberal source.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
generally, who do you think is like probably better at evaluating like student outcomes, like author or like the
Wait,
incentives of parents, like
I have a
authors who are
question?
paid to write about it, or like high school debaters?
What? Can I have a question?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Why were charter schools created in the first place?
The neo, so what our evidence indicates says that neoliberalists like George Bush
Yeah.
really wanted there to be market competition.
Yeah. And why did people across the United States accept the creation of new schools?
I mean, I don't think it's really about whether they accepted it or not. There's a lot of people that don't like it. It's just the state law.
Then why do people go to them?
Here's the analysis that's really important, right? Which is that it's not the difference between a good school and a bad school. It's the difference between having a school at all because your school is shutting down. It's not only Detroit, it's also Philadelphia. It's a lot of areas, or it's like having a slightly better school that only 2 million kids across the country can go to. Your side neglects 50 million kids, 7 million of which are African American, which is like the main lynch point of your case, which is like achievement gap. Okay, also on your point about like collaboration, so is it that schools are like collaborating with each other, in which case like why are they competing? Why is there greater accountability? Like I'm just a little confused like what you're
they're just both pushing each other to be better because their end goal is to help their students. It's not to like cutthroat each other. They're not businesses. It's still education.
They are businesses because charter schools are privately funded a lot of the time.
They're still held accountable to the government.
Charter schools are accountable to the government.
Yeah, that's how they open.
I thought you said though that like the reason why they can do more things is
we're out of time, but I mean it's like a different level of accountability. It's not like bureaucracy, but like they still have to show that they're doing stuff.
All right, this time.
Okay. It's going to be my case, weighing, and then their case. Is everybody ready? Okay. Let's start the time right now. Start off on our case. Our first argument is about how charter schools siphon funding from public schools. That's because schools determine funding based on student enrollment. That's why in places like Detroit, where charter schools have been around for 20 years, we've seen hundreds of schools close specifically due to charter schools. They have a few responses. The first one is that they say that Detroit was already failing prior to this. That's not true. Our Blakely evidence indicates specifically that it was the introduction of charter schools. The weighing here is really clear. You can either have Detroit schools, which maybe weren't performing that great beforehand, but still provide hundreds of thousands of students with education, or you can have those hundreds of thousands of students get no education at all. The second thing that he says is that charter schools and public schools actually collaborate together. And this evidence comes from the evidence at the bottom of his case, where he says that like overall public schools do a lot better. However, he doesn't respond to the two refutations we've given throughout this entire round, which is firstly, that public schools do this by cutting things like janitors and also like counselors, which decreases mental health. But secondly, that in the age of COVID and recession, public schools have already made all of those cuts, which is why in the status quo, charter schools just cause them to close down. Lastly, he talks about how like competition is solving for education and that they're closing the achievement gap. But this functionally doesn't matter because what our second subpoint tells you, and this is where you're voting, is that things like the achievement gap are now only defined by test scores. That's because when charter schools were introduced to the system, it created market competition. And then neoliberalists passed mandatory testing to evaluate that market competition. Because of that, our evidence indicates that teaching to the test then trades off with other things like the social and political aspects of our lives, which then causes people to not be able to think critically. It perpetuates the structural inequalities in the status quo. All he says is that charter schools innovate. This is not what we're talking about. We say that the introduction of charter schools meant that the entirety of public schools now have to take standardized tests, not just public schools. But secondly, he never responds to the perspective evidence, which says that specifically the innovations that charter schools do when you isolate for those innovations have been really bad. Go on to his case. The weighing is really clear because he doesn't respond to it. Even if you think their entire case is true, you're not granting them access to any of it because overall educational outcomes or like schools only account for 14% of outcome. And if students can't critique the other structural things that cause these things like poverty, mass incarceration, etc., which only our case allows them by diversifying the curriculum, then that means that none of those other problems are ever solved. For all of those reasons, we are very happy to negate. Thank you.
We have 10 seconds of left. I'm just gonna, let's see what happens. Okay. Okay. if everyone's ready, time will start now. Let's start at the beginning. Why were charter schools created in the first place? Hatchinger 19 finds that before charter schools were created in 1988, public schools were failing on every measure of success. They were not innovating, they had low test scores, they had lower levels of funding, and they had lower levels of accountability. People would not just let new schools come out of nowhere for no reason. The reason they accepted charter schools is because it was better than the alternative, which is a stuffy bureaucracy of the public school system. But their argument is that charter schools steal funding from public schools. But let's talk about that really quickly. Barnum 19 indicates that the end goal of both charter schools and public schools is to help their students. They're not businesses, they're in education. This is why the evidence indicates that when charter schools are next to public schools, they work together to create better innovative practices, higher test scores, and overall a higher quality of education. But let's say you believe their evidence and that charter schools do steal funding from public schools. It's still not the case. Recognize that they dropped the Johnson 19 evidence that 34 states have provisions that offset funding so that when enrollment moves from a public school to a charter school, they don't decrease funding as much so that public schools aren't hurt. But let's think about this logically. What happens in the long run? Does the public school say, oh, we lost 15% of our funding, now we're just going to give up? No, they become more efficient and drive to be better, which is why charter schools are helping. But let's recognize their last argument is about the collapse of the United States democracy due to a lack of critical thinking, yet they continue to say that charter schools are a minuscule portion of the education system. Make them pick one. Really small, big impact? Probably not. But the reason that you vote for the affirmative is by increasing the diversity of teachers. Recognize they concede that the achievement gap is going down right now. If this was true, that charter schools are really damaging the rest of the education system, then the achievement gap should be going up. But charter schools push students to compete, and they have 50% more diverse teachers, which means they're less likely to be disciplined and more likely to be placed in gifted and education programs. At the end of the day, the truth is on our side. Test scores are going up, the achievement gap is going down, and charters aren't hurting anything. Thus, we affirm.
Good run.
debate, y'all.
Good round, y'all.
Okay, so it looks like I was the last one to vote then, which I guess means I'm the one that has to tell everyone, correct? Okay. So on a 2-1 vote, Khan does win this round. Congrats to that team for advancing forward.
Congratulations on a great debate. Thank you, judges. You're all welcome to leave, and team going forward, get ready for the next round. Thank you.
All right. Thank y'all so much for judging.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job, guys. It was a great debate.